South African elections are not usually cliffhangers. Since apartheid was dismantled and the universal franchise established in the early 1990s, there have been 6 general elections. The same party, the African National Congress, has won all of them. If polls ahead of this week's South African election are to be believed, this time it might be different. Nobody expects the ANC to lose exactly, but they might lose their parliamentary majority, perhaps compelling them to govern in coalition with other parties, whether they're familiar liberal foes, the Democratic Alliance, leftist fire-breathers, the Economic Freedom Fighters, or new party Umkhonto we Sizwe, led by disgraced former President and ANC leader Jacob Zuma, and rather cheekily named after the ANC paramilitaries once commanded by Nelson Mandela, the irreproachably heroic figure on whose legend the ANC still trades. The reasons for the ANC's ebbing popularity are not difficult to diagnose. On the ANC's interminable watch, crime, corruption, unemployment and power outages have all become inexcusably rampant. Nevertheless, many South Africans still seem to perceive the ANC as a liberation movement, as opposed to a rabble of bungling crooks who can't keep the lights on. Could this be the election at which the ANC's grip on power slips? Why do people still vote for them, despite everything? And how does anyone win an argument with the party of Mandela? This is the Foreign Desk.
There are people who vote for the ANC because where they live, and some of the services that they're able to access have been brought by policies of the ANC. So whether we're talking the social security, or whether we're talking access to education, like say, higher education to universities, etc., many people who support the ANC will tell you that they are where they are because of the policies of the ANC.
The thing about countries like South Africa with our kind of past, where dominant movements are supported based on their past. So people almost vote like trauma-born voting. They vote for the party continually based on the past, based on identity, based on emotions. And then, that goes on for a very, very long time until it's very late.
It was a huge monolith, the ANC. When I was the leader of the opposition, they got 69% of the national vote, and they dominated the whole of society. It really was a hegemon then, and no longer today, of course, but it certainly had 30 years of almost unbridled power.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I'm joined first of all by Nwabisa Makunga, editor of the Sowetan, a national daily publication in Johannesburg. Nwabisa, first of all, let's look at what those polls are telling us. And if the ANC do get their wings clipped, as polls suggest, is that going to change them as an organisation?
I think we need to understand kind of the ANC's history and corruption record, right? And many people are quite frustrated by it, and understandably so. So it's really about, the quality of its deployees and obviously their proximity to power and state money, but it's also about a lack of consequences, right? So if you look kind of over the years, just how many people have been arrested or even expelled out of the party for wrongdoing, quite, very few. But under Cyril Ramaphosa, so Cyril Ramaphosa came in and basically said, look, I'm coming in to clean this party. And to some degree, yes, he has kind of dealt with people who are either corrupt or accused of wrongdoing. But the problem is that for every person that the party has actually dealt with in that way or held accountable, there are much more people it hasn't done that to. And I think that's the problem. So if we're looking at if they do lose power, will this actually change them? It's difficult to say, but their record is essentially showing that, although they may take one step, ahead, they take 2 steps backward.
Because the likelihood is that they won't lose power completely, but there is a possibility that they may be reliant on other parties in order to form a parliamentary majority. Is anyone taking bets yet on what the likeliest composition of South Africa's first coalition government would be?
I think that's what we are all really interested to see. One, look, if it will happen, but also, who it is that they're likely to be talking to. So, of course, the trouble with making that kind of perhaps assumption is that coalition talks in South Africa are very, very fluid. They're very unpredictable. So you will see, for example, where elsewhere in the world where, political parties that have a similar ideology will kind of club together. But in South Africa, we've seen, particularly if you look at 2016, which was when the coalition story really became our reality, in local governments, you'll find parties that are completely on the different sides of the ideological spectrum and really working together, to form a government. Of course, those coalitions are often quite wobbly, they're not stable. But I think, the point here is that they can be in a coalition with pretty much anybody. And really the decider, what we've seen is normally that whatever it is that is of interest at that particular time, then they're willing to actually, negotiate on the basis of that.
I know there's been a lot of talk about them striking some sort of bargain with the economic freedom fighters, who are a obviously fairly rumbustious left-wing organisation led by a disaffected former ANC member. If that kind of coalition was put together, is it clear what sort of concessions a group like the EFF would want?
Yes, I think it is. So we know pretty much exactly what the EFF wants, right? What we don't know is what the ANC is willing to sacrifice. So if we're looking at kind of the big ticket stuff, so the EFF, they want obviously nationalization of land, nationalization of banks without compensation, talking the Reserve Bank, etc., which are stuff that is really, highly unlikely to happen. We know quite recently, they've been talking about, if you're looking at like what is more practical, Julius Malema has been talking about making his deputy, Floyd Shivambu, the finance minister. So we know pretty much clear about the fact that they're really looking, at the economic cluster of leadership in government. And so, whether or not the ANC, of course, is willing to give that up is really, the big question. But we know exactly what it is that the EFF does want.
As you were saying, coalition governments that have been established at more local levels in South Africa have been fairly ideologically fluid, marriages of convenience, you might say. That being the case, is there any possibility that depending how the numbers shake out, we could see the ANC developing a partnership with Jacob Zuma's party, Mkhonto we Sizwe, or even perhaps with their old school opposition, the Democratic Alliance?
So again, a very fluid situation. But if you look at things now, right, it's highly unlikely that they may form a coalition, agreement with Jacob Zuma's party, right? I think the bridges there are quite burnt, although, of course, as I say, anything can happen. There is a group of people in the ANC who have spoken about possibly a coalition with the Democratic Alliance. How widespread that sentiment is in the ANC, we don't know. But there have been, particularly if you look at the veterans of the ANC, some of them have actually come out to say, look, for stability, it may be the most stable coalition, although not perfect. And of course, they're not necessarily talking ideology here. They're simply talking about what would be a workable government. As I say, whether that belief or that sentiment is really entrenched in the ANC is in doubt, but those possibilities do exist.
A lot of the pre-election narrative has been about this prospect of the ANC, if not losing power, then at least losing its majority in Parliament. But that neglects the fact that whatever happens and whatever the reasons not to, millions of South Africans are going to vote for the ANC. From your point of view, what is the reason for that? Because obviously when you look at the record, if you look at the general state of South Africa, there is endemic corruption, as you've suggested. There's absolutely chronic crime. There's almost daily power cuts. Unemployment is 33%, even worse for young people. The Human Development Report says South Africa's the most unequal country in the world. I mean, it's not an impressive record. So why are millions of people going to vote for the ANC anyway?
It's a very complex question and an important one. People in South Africa experience the country differently. So, everything you've just listed now is absolutely correct, right? But I also think that there is slight nuance. So there are people who vote for the ANC, and not necessarily because of history, by the way, but there are people who vote for the ANC because where they live, and some of the services that they're able to access have been brought by policies of the ANC. So whether we're talking sort of social security, or whether we're talking access to education, like say, higher education to universities, etc., many people who support the ANC will tell you that they are where they are, notwithstanding the fact that, it's not perfect, it's quite a challenged country. They will tell you that we are where we are because of the policies of the ANC. So that, I think that's on the one part, there is that. But on the other part is really about the quality of the opposition. So you will have people who say, yes, I support the ANC because this is where they've brought me to where I am. But at the same time, you've got people who say, well, I don't support the ANC necessarily, but I definitely don't want the other guys. The picture when we're looking, across the road is not a pretty one as well. So it's quite a mix of people, but within their reasons, you then can tell that the ANC comes out, victorious.
There's just one thing I wanted to pick up on there finally, which is the question of the degree to which the ANC trades on past glories, because I think that's quite a common assumption outside South Africa, that it is still able to pitch itself as as the party that brought down apartheid, the party of Nelson Mandela. But of course, that is all starting to become quite a long time ago. I think I'm probably right in saying that most South Africans were not yet born when President Mandela walked free from prison. So is that really no longer a factor at all? Is it not something even the ANC try to advance when they're campaigning?
So the ANC, yes, of course, will talk about the history of South Africa and its contribution to where we are now. But it's not the foremost story that they're telling. So if you look at this year, particularly being the 30th year of our democracy, what the ANC had done was to tell a story of, what it has done over the last 30 years. And notwithstanding, as I say, some of the crises that we have, power issues, development, etc., and crime, but they're able to point to people's lives that actually have been changed because of their policies. People who have had, access to housing, people who've had access to water, healthcare, and all of that. The story that they're telling more than anything is not so much a story of the past before 1994. They're saying that we have people that we can point to whose lives we have changed based on the policies that we have.
Nwabisa, thank you for joining us. That was Nwabisa Makunga with the Sowetan. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. For a wider look at the internal culture of the ANC, I'm joined now by William Gumede, founder of the Democracy Works Foundation, which is a mediator of opposition party alliances, and a professor at the University of Witwatersrand and author of Thabo Mbeki and the Battle for the Soul of the ANC. William, I guess what we're trying to establish here is how, when and why it all went wrong for the ANC. The state that they're in now, is it just what happens when one party has been in power too long, or is there something unusual about the ANC?
I mean, the ANC really has fallen foul of the sort of typical liberation party, being in power for too long, gets very complacent, unaccountable, irresponsible, and so on. And I think that's the one part of it. And the second one is also that voters, given the ANC really a free pass for a very, very long time. The thing about countries like South Africa with our kind of pass, where dominant movements are supported based on their past. In the case of South Africa, the African National Congress is struggle against apartheid. So people almost vote like trauma-born voting. They vote for a party continually based on the past, based on identity, based on emotions. And then, that goes on for a very, very long time until it's very late.
That particular aspect, though, that you mentioned, the idea of them being a revolutionary movement, a liberation movement that wins their battle and arrives in power, it's not an uncommon phenomenon, but have they also spent 30 years discovering that being an opposing revolutionary insurgent movement is kind of exciting and glamorous and has a great sense of purpose and comradeship, and then you get into government and it's hard and it's boring and people want their potholes filled in and their rubbish collected, and it's just not as exciting?
No, yeah, I mean, you're absolutely correct there. Really, our liberation movements are really not fit for purpose to govern. And that really has been the case in South Africa. The ANC, when it entered power, its political leaders did not have the competence to run a sophisticated state, to start off with that. Secondly, just its policies. If you're in opposition, you don't really need to think about policies. I mean, you just have one thing, and sort of the glue is get the party government out. You don't have to think beyond that. To run a sophisticated state, you need to have sophisticated policies. So, I mean, the first couple of years, the ANC just had really irrational policies, toxic policies that really didn't make sense.
How big a part of their problem has been, though, and this is another, I guess, difficulty peculiar to the ANC, of just perpetually having this impossible act to follow, by which I mean, of course, President Nelson Mandela, this unarguably heroic figure regarded not just in South Africa, but by most of the world as a sort of secular saint. The only way was going to be down, wasn't it?
The ANC, interestingly, if you compare to other liberation movements in Africa, actually had really a broad range of capable and quality leaders. Now, the problem was that after Mandela, things went wrong. Mandela, the way he led was in the context of diversity. The idea for Mandela that South Africa is the most diverse society on earth, and that he, as a president, and also the ANC that he was in charge of, needed to govern not only in the diverse interests of society, but also using the skill set and ideas and energy of all South Africans. I mean, that was absolutely important. I mean, and when he left, what happened afterwards, the ANC became a very narrow party only for its own constituency, marginalizing competence and skills and ideas outside the ANC. The dominant part of the party that came from exile was sort of ideological rigidity. So many policies were policies from the Cold War era, ideological policies that didn't work in Eastern Europe or didn't work in the rest of Africa. And then it introduced a couple of those kind of policies in South Africa, which actually was an absolute disaster. So it's a combination, I think, one, the quality of leadership. Secondly, just really poor, outdated policies that did not make sense. And sort of thirdly, the arrogance of being in power. So, not listening to criticism, not listening to alternative ideas.
Those faults in particular, I think certainly to a lot of people looking at South Africa from outside, were very much embodied by President Jacob Zuma. And I think there was a fairly convenient narrative arc there, the decline from Nelson Mandela to Jacob Zuma. But because Zuma was such an extraordinary and flagrant crook, this idea took hold that the ANC is just institutionally irrecoverably corrupt. Is that actually entirely fair, though?
Yes, the party, what has happened, we were relatively uncorrupt during the Mbeki era, and we had the kind of growth that we needed as the country, although he started a process of marginalizing more and more non-ANC people and being more hostile to sort of non-ANC business and civil society, and so on, started that process. Then Jacob Zuma came to power, and he really caused so much destruction. So even when Cyril Ramaphosa took over from Jacob Zuma, what Cyril Ramaphosa was doing was really almost going back to where Mbeki ended. So not even moving forward, it's just recovering lost ground rather than moving forward. And this is exactly where we are. In the party itself, under Jacob Zuma, the corruption became so institutional that one can only clean it up by breaking the ANC. And Cyril Ramaphosa, as the leader of the ANC, has been too cautious to do that because he didn't want to upset ANC members and ANC leaders and so on. Now the party has almost become irreversibly corrupt, and it can only be cleaned up. According to the former ANC leader, Deputy President Kgalema Motlanthe, he said the ANC can only renew or clean up if it's in opposition.
Well, just finally then, and on that thought, I mean, it seems unlikely that the ANC ending up in opposition will be a result of this election, but does it strike you as something that South Africa might see within the next 10 or 20 years? Not maybe this election, maybe not the one after that, but maybe the one after that, the ANC actually losing power?
The ANC has such a strong majority. If it loses majority in this election, and it has to put a coalition government together, it will still be in power if that's the case, but it would be seen as a defeat in South Africa by its own members and also by the broader public, because it would force the party for the first time to be, to be humble and to really become more responsible and accountable and more common sense like, and so on. So even if the ANC remains in power, if it's part of a coalition, it really would, in South Africa, would be seen as a sea change. And in the next election, 2029, we are very likely that we will see the ANC totally out of power. But this election in South Africa is the most uncertain election, and it will go to the wire. The people will still, I think, will make up their minds even in the booth itself, in the election booth itself. In the last national election, 9 million South Africans registered to vote but did not vote, and that presumably most of them were ANC supporters, but they were so disgruntled with the party they didn't vote, but they did not want to vote for the opposition parties because they were so emotionally attached to the ANC. This election, it is very likely that many of them, will make their decision to finally break this trauma bond with the ANC and not vote for the party. And the party may get below 40%. And it would be impossible for it to put a government together.
That was William Gumede, author of Thabo Mbeki and the Battle for the Soul of the ANC. You're listening to The Foreign Desk. This is the Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Mueller. For all the obvious deficiencies of the ANC, it has been obviously difficult for any other parties to put much of a dent in them. Our next guest knows better than most how hard it has been. Tony Leon was South Africa's opposition leader from 1999 to 2007 as head of the Democratic Alliance. He is also the author, most recently, of Future Tense, Reflections on My Troubled Land. Tony, just basically, can you describe what it is like to set yourself up to go up against the party of Nelson Mandela?
Well, when Nelson Mandela was in charge, that was a huge task. Even when I became the leader of the opposition, I was in parliament under Mandela, but actually became the head of the official opposition in 1999 against Thabo Mbeki. And I described it in a book I wrote of those days as being against Goliath. I mean, really, it was a huge monolith, the ANC. When I was the leader of the opposition, they got 69% of the national vote, and they dominated the whole of society. It really was a hegemon then, and no longer today, of course, but it certainly had 30 years of almost unbridled power.
In the elections in which you went up against them, where did you feel like you were able to make inroads? Because in 1999, the Democratic Party, as it then was, did go from 7 seats to 38, although the ANC also went further ahead. But did you feel like you had actually picked off any of their voters?
No, very few. It really was a rearrangement of the opposition. I mean, in politics, you go after the low-hanging fruit, and the fruits available to be harvested, forgive my strained metaphor, was really the votes that had traditionally gone to bigger opposition parties like the New National Party, and to some extent in Carter in the 1994 election, the Freedom Front. And we scooped them up into the Democratic Party, which later became the Democratic Alliance. But the actual formation of the DA, as it is today, which is 24 years ago, was to try and close down that inter-opposition conflict and competition, to take the fight to the majority. And that is an unending task and an uncompleted one as of our speaking today. But that was the idea behind the Democratic Alliance project.
But that Democratic Alliance did make further progress in 2004. You went from 38 seats to 50, although, again, in fairness, the ANC are also pulling further ahead. At that point, do you feel like you're making any progress? Because at that point, the ANC have been in charge for a decade. The problems with their governance are starting to become apparent. Did you start to get any sense that people were thinking, maybe let's give the Democratic Alliance a try?
Yeah, some did. And I mean, obviously, our trump card back then was that the president of South Africa, Mbeki, was an AIDS denialist. And there were millions of South Africans were sick or dying of HIV/AIDS without proper treatment. So we did get, I mean, I don't mean sound ghoulish, but we did get some electoral dividend from that fact, because we were in the province that we then governed, still today, the Western Cape, we're providing antiretroviral medicines despite the national policy not to do so. But I have to say, since I left the leadership of the party back in 2007, 2009, the party's actually increased its support significantly since then. So today has crested over 20% of national support. It's still not much in a multi-party democracy, but it's double or even more than it was a decade or so ago. And I think the big question now is, will this election be a breakthrough election or not?
I mean, among the ANC's opponents, though, does the Democratic Alliance in particular, do you think, still suffer from a perception that it's a party for white people? Maybe nice, liberal white people, but nonetheless, it's a party for white people.
Oh, well, that's certainly the branding it's got. Of course, it's not true, because for the Democratic Alliance to simply have the support it has achieved at the moment, given the very significant decline of whites as a percentage of the voting population, has to mean the party is adding from all other communities. I mean, I have to say as well, we have in the Western Cape, the majority of people here are coloured, and they very significantly vote for the DA. In KwaZulu-Natal, Indians do the same. So there is a wedge of Black African support as well. Otherwise, the DA simply wouldn't be in the electoral game at all as a consequential player, which it clearly is. But I think, the monolith that it almost was part of your African birthright, that you were obliged because of the liberation role played by the ANC to vote for the ANC. I think that really has started to fade, and we'll see it fading further next Wednesday in the election.
Well, if that is the case, and I know there is a lot of discussion about what a future government might look like if it turns out the ANC cannot command a majority, should the Democratic Alliance, if the option is there, be willing to entertain going into business with the ANC, or might there be a fear that they just kind of drag your party down with them?
I think both parts of that question are highly relevant. I think if nothing in politics, as you know, Andrew, runs along straight lines, much more jagged than a simple binary choice. But if the ANC does poorly and they need a big coalition partner, or at least have some kind of arrangement, such as a confidence and supply, then I think there are a number of options. If the option on the one hand is the ANC forms a government with the EFF, which really will destroy this country and its economy, or does some arrangement with the DA, then I genuinely think that the DA would have to give very serious consideration to performing a national service, even if it isn't to the party's best interests. I'm not sure it's going to be that straightforward. And I think you're quite right in your question to avert to the dangers it would pose to a party like the DA, and what would be the terms and conditions. The devil, as always, will be in the detail. The other very difficult thing in South Africa is we are completely unused to having a national coalition, and there are only 14 days between the declaration and the result, probably next Saturday, and the election of the president, which has to be 14 days later. So, if you look at European coalition formations, they traditionally take months. Well, here you'd have 2 weeks to make some arrangement, and I don't know what would happen. It really would be uncharted territory.
Would you have any lessons to impart, do you think, about how to oppose the ANC? Because it strikes me there's such a curious case in that if you look at their actual record, it is not one that most parties in most democracies would care to run on, and yet they keep winning and winning and winning. What actually does work?
There's a lot of history attached to voting in this country. 30 years is on one hand a long time, but if you look at it with a longer view over centuries of dispossession, discrimination, apartheid, then it's not such a long time. And what the ANC's done in this election, having such, as you've indicated, an appalling record to defend, is to cast everyone back to 1994. You'll see, for example, Nelson Mandela much featured in their advertising, because those golden years really is what the ANC is reminding people. I think that works up to a point, but I think it's starting not to work, particularly among middle-class people, younger voters, so-called born frees who really are not that invested in the past, but more concerned about the present and the future. And I think that will be reflected in the results. So if you ask me for advice, I think the DA has to do what the DA has done in this election, that is to hammer on the current record of the government, on the high unemployment, the staggering crime rate here, the electricity blackouts we've had, although miraculously disappeared for the last 50 days, and the corruption. I think the biggest single factor, which is true of any polity, especially in emerging democracies, is that the ruling party is irredeemably corrupt. It's not just Zuma was corrupt, the whole party has been corrupted and remains corrupt. And that's probably the biggest single selling point for the opposition in this election.
Just a final very quick thought, just curious. It probably won't happen at this election, but are you able to imagine an election any time in the future at which the ANC actually lose and end up being the opposition?
I absolutely do. And it's not just that I imagine it here. We have, I wrote a book called Future Tense a few years ago, and I pointed out after 30 years, the liberation parties run out of road. And you saw that in India with the Congress Party. You saw that in Israel with the Labour Party. I mean, these were one-party hegemons. Liberation, independence came via their stout efforts or staunch efforts, and yet they get corrupted by power. The Mexican Revolutionary Party stayed in longer, but only by rigging the polls. Well, happily, we don't have rigged polls in South Africa, but there's a pattern. And I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of the ANC. It might not happen this election, but it's certainly going to happen. And I would add this, Andrew, that in what is an absolute racing certainty for next Wednesday's election in South Africa is what's going to happen in the provinces. You know, we have simultaneous national and provincial elections. Well, in the last election, only this Western Cape province was delivered to a DA opposition vote. There are at least 3 other provinces where on any reading of any poll, the ANC is going to struggle to form a provincial government. And I think that's going to herald a change, which, if it doesn't happen nationally, is certainly going to happen provincially this time.
Tony Leon, thank you very much for joining us on the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Chris Chermak and Christy O'Grady. Christy also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email chris@cc@monocle.com, and don't forget to subscribe to Monocle Magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Mueller, thanks very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.